Hello and welcome. Thanks for checking out this the JakartaOne all today. And in this session, want to share my experience in migrating ActiveMQ to Jakarta EE. So let's jump in. Just a brief introduction about me in some of the areas and projects that I've been involved in. In short, been working for most of my career helping large enterprises implement open source as part of their infrastructure, whether it's the Linux operating system or all the way up through middleware stacks. But for the most part, as it relates to this talk, I'll be talking from my contributions with the Apache ActiveMQ project. I'm a PMC member and committer, and I led the effort to convert ActiveMQ to Jakarta. As a brief, I'm sure you guys have all been on the stream all day, so but just to recap quickly, if people are wondering what is Jakarta EE, um, essentially what it is, it's a group of APIs that sit on top of Java to enable enterprise type development. And with the new licensing structure, similar to how the JDK has been freed from unfriendly licensing, now these enterprise APIs have been also freed up. And as part of this, the transition, we've got to do a little bit of namespace changing. So everywhere in your Java code where you saw import Java X, essentially you're now going to just write it as import Jakarta JMS, right? As easy as that, hopefully. As it turns out, with a big and mature code base, things can be a little bit more complicated than that. So that's what we're going to talk through in this talk. So as an overview, ActiveMQ is the most widely used message broker in the world with a very mature code base. It has over 30 Maven modules. This covers a wide range of Jakarta EEs. And so the purpose of this talk is talk about strategies and approaches and the lessons learned that we applied while converting ActiveMQ to Jakarta EE, with the idea that if in your enterprise, if you've got large mature code bases that also need to make the transition, that some of these strategies, approaches, and lesson learned would help you in your organization make the same transition successfully. So from an involvement perspective, the reason we're involved in my job that pays the bills is I'm the co-founder and CTO of Height. ActiveMQ powers the message broker inside our platform, and we build a platform on top of ActiveMQ that provides Kubernetes-based deployment, self-service, and we're driving towards queue as a service capability for message queues. And we've developed a bunch of advanced features on top of ActiveMQ, including things like full search, import, export, auto rebalance, and many others. And we led, us at Height, we led the ActiveMQ migration to Jakarta EE, and we're the driving force behind a lot of the neat new feature developments in ActiveMQ. So that's how we got involved with ActiveMQ and why we're still engaged with the community. Okay, so let's jump into the migration area. So I think it's helpful to kind of think of this as, at the very beginning, first slide, we're like, hey, let's just do a bunch of search and replace and you're done. But when you have a mature code base, you're always dealing with where is that code base? What point in time is that code base as it relates to the larger ecosystem? So, no matter where you are with your enterprise application, there's going to be some level of technical debt. If you haven't updated in 2 weeks, there's probably a dependency that needs to be updated. Mature code bases have been around for a dozen or more years. You'll be looking at JDK build tool updates. And then lastly, we can talk about, some of the Jakarta API impacts. And so I think it helps to think about the problem, breaking it up into these three areas, and we'll discuss how we attack that with ActiveMQ. So technical debt, this is the big thing. The catch here is most of the work in making a migration really has to do with tackling any technical debt that's piled up. So especially with ActiveMQ, jumping straight to Jakarta wasn't really realistic because it had accumulated some technical debt. And also ActiveMQ is really widely adopted, not only as a server, like messaging and infrastructure layer, but it's also embedded and used in a lot of other open source and commercial products to in embedded unit tests and integration tests because it's used very extensively as well for other applications to certify their JMS support. So taking something that you think is just server side and okay, we're going to flip the switch and jump to Jakarta, it's just not realistic. We had to be really mindful that making these changes was going to break a lot of people's not only back-end infrastructure or had the potential to break infrastructure, integration, and unit tests as well. So we want to be mindful of all those things. Secondly, the big update that ActiveMQ had in the technical debt areas is while ActiveMQ has long been the bearer of the JMS spec standard, it's been very good in that area, and many people, like I said, use it to certify their products for JMS compatibility. There's a big feature that was added in JMS2 that ActiveMQ for a long time didn't really bother with, and the reason was because there was a better feature known as virtual topics, which was much more flexible and useful than that key feature, the shared topic subscriptions. However, once we started looking at, okay, we need to move over to Jakarta, it really became clear that it was going to be impractical just to continue that approach. We really needed to bite the bullet and start adding the JMS 2.0 features. And so that was a big piece of the technical debt that ActiveMQ needed to tackle. So to do that, what we did is we settled on an approach that essentially we'd level up where the code base was from a technical debt perspective, and we would jump all that up to something current, and we would have two release streams running simultaneously. So we could have a pre-Jakarta, essentially a pre-Jakarta release that we're gonna level up and clear up as much technical debt as possible, and then we'd start on the Jakarta changes in a new release. And so those became ActiveMQ. It's the 518 series. So that has optional client side Jakarta EE support. So most applications that work with ActiveMQ use it as a client. They use it to send and receive messages from their message queues or topics. And so the idea here is this would be a low impact change for applications that needed to quickly start adopting Jakarta. We can provide a client library without necessarily having to have the server side done because the bulk of the lines of code change and all that was really on the server side. So the ActiveMQ 518 release served as kind of that bridge. We leveled up the technical debt, and then we provided this optional client-side Jakarta client library. So while we were working on the server side, applications could start that were client only could start consuming basically that new client jar in a Jakarta environment. Additionally, we wanted to have some key project goals. So while these two release streams are going, we want to make sure there's compatibility is maintained between client and servers, even if they have a mix of the non-Jakarta or the Java X JMS and the Jakarta JMS. So you could use a 517 ActiveMQ jar and talk to a 6.0 broker or vice versa. You could use a newer jar and talk to an older broker. So this is going to help alleviate the stress and place that if applications need to update, it's not going to force the infrastructure because that starts dragging and forcing organizations to have to upgrade completely entirely across their organization. That we didn't want to tightly couple client to broker change because that would force your whole environment to have to change at once. So this is it seems like a small subtle thing, but in organizations that have large deployments or lots of applications in integration space, this is a really big thing to be able to support mixing Jakarta, non-Jakarta at the same time, because we're not forcing everybody and all applications to upgrade at once. Secondly, we want to really, as best possible, we want to maintain the ability to backport changes going forward between these two releases. So for example, in the 6 series, we started adding more features around observability, performance metrics, things around improving the quality of capability for multi-tenancy. So any of these cool new features that we also wanted to have the ability to backport them. So without everyone having to be, a major Git ninja, we wanted to keep those commits manageable to where we could backport a lot of these cool features. So as much as possible, we wanted to keep the word Jakarta kind of behind the scenes. So if we added a new feature, we could plug that in and move code and security changes from 6.0 back into the 518. And so that was a big win for us. So really, this is the big aha moment was we were going to maintain 2 release streams, a leveled up reduced technical debt version that's pre-Jakarta, and then the Jakarta-based version in 6. So just on a deep dive, this was a really, I think, a novel approach, and this would apply not only for code bases that are making the change to Jakarta, but also for code bases that need to support moving APIs, even if it's your internal application. So what we did is in the 518 series, so we wanted to be able to provide both Java X and Jakarta support. So we had a new module, which was just the ActiveMQ client Jakarta jar. So applications that needed to start using Jakarta APIs, they could pull this jar in specifically and start consuming ActiveMQ on a client basis as in a Jakarta environment against a non-Jakarta broker. Um, and to do that, if you remember earlier, we talked about we had to start adding JMS 2.0 features. Well, we didn't want to tightly couple all that work. It would have been too much. And in the open source world, it's hard to get all those votes to get all the approvals out. So we wanted to do everything very incrementally. Um, and so what we did, the novel approach here was by implementing this new module, it being new, we're not breaking semantic versioning. We could start adding those new methods one at a time during point releases. So the very first jar that went out, all the new JMS 2.0 methods just simply threw an unsupported operation exception. So that worked. This created a novel approach. So if you're using the jar and you're using it in essentially a JMS 1.1 way, you're not going to have any problems. It's all just going to work. Once you want to start using JMS 2.0 operations, you'd have to really make sure that it was ready for you. And as we started adding JMS 2.0 operations, we would start filling in the implementations on a method by method basis and removing those areas of code that were just throwing unsupported operation exception. So this is a really neat way. So if you look at kind of on a big picture, like project management, product owner perspective, we were able to do a couple things at once without breaking clients and without tightly coupling applications to infrastructure and then infrastructure to all the other applications that talk to that same infrastructure. So really, really neat that some of the simple novel approaches ended up working out really well. In 6.0, really the big story here is that ActiveMQ 6, that's the Jakarta support on the server side. Eclipse, Jetty, the Jetty infrastructure provides the HTTP services. This was the really big update in ActiveMQ. So when we make the change to Jetty, not only did it was there namespace changes, but there were also code implementation changes. The way Jetty worked essentially changed between the versions 9 and 11 that we moved to. Unfortunately for us, Jetty did something really, really cool. And I think other platforms, I wish we would have done this really with ActiveMQ is after we started the work on ActiveMQ, Jetty made a release change that what Jetty 12 does is Jetty 12 supports both Java X and Jakarta at the same time. So if you were to upgrade and adopt Jetty 12 today, you could do what we're talking about with a lot less headache. And we're having to do kind of one more upgrade from 11 to 12. So if you haven't started, this is going to be your big aha moment to skip some pain. Just jump straight to Jetty 12, and you can do this two release stream strategy with a few less headaches. So yeah, so we started the work on Jakarta, but it was before Jetty 12 was released. Jetty 12 did this great thing that allows you to do both Jakarta and non-Jakarta or pre-Jakarta APIs. Just on a side note, Jetty 12 support is underway in ActiveMQ. We're in the pull request for that's in progress. I think there's a couple minor things that need worked out, and it'll be integrated into a future ActiveMQ 6. And it may be backported. If we backported it on the 5 side, it would have to be it'd be like a 519 or 520 type deal. There's no firm plans on that, but that would be something that we could potentially do with both active release streams at the same time. ActiveMQ, one of the things ActiveMQ uses, it uses Spring to kind of wire all of its components together. And making the jump to Jakarta meant making the jump to Spring 6. When you make the jump to Spring 6, you also drag a Java JDK 17 requirement because Spring 6 requires JDK 17. So we also had to level to 17, which is not a big deal. We want to be moving forward with JDKs as well. But what this meant is With infrastructure products like databases, message queues, you often like to have the client code be current, but be able to go back a couple JDK layers. As big enterprise infrastructure tends to move a little slower. Um, glacially is sometimes a term used. It would have been nice for ActiveMQ to be able to support JDK 8 or 11 a little bit longer with the Jakarta, but the Spring 6 dependency, forced it into a JDK 17 world. So not a big deal. Moving forward's better anyway. Maybe we'll drag some enterprises up with us as well. Most of the JDK 17 changes were minor. We did separate them into separate commits to keep things backport friendly. Maven and other toolchain updates weren't a major issue for us. When we're talking about leveling up your technical debt and your projects, that's one of the easiest things to start trying to move forward is the JDK in your toolchain in your integration layer. So definitely recommend moving forward with those pieces where you can early. Jakarta EE changes, right? Super easy. We're just gonna search and replace and be done, right? Um, No, and I think the cool thing about what's happening with Jakarta is now, like the JDK is getting all these really cool new features. It's coming at a good, consistent pace. Now we're going to start seeing this or we are seeing it with the Jakarta APIs. So now we're seeing really good and long needed features coming to these enterprise APIs that are used across the board. So we're excited about it in general. ActiveMQ. The Jakarta APIs that are in scope here, obviously Jakarta messaging, previously known as JMS, servlet, transaction, and XML. Um, and then there was one J2E spec that was actually dropped. So this spec was in the J2E world, but did not come across or come over when the Jakarta change was made. So there is no Jakarta management spec anymore. So we dropped that. And what we did with that is we essentially had to just what this spec was used for is metrics and tracking, like statistics. So kind of like a pre-micrometer type deal where you can have metrics that sample and keep track of what time the metrics came in, things of that nature. So we went ahead and just what we called self-hosted those interfaces and those classes. So no longer, so we basically rip off the implements statistic and we made our own interfaces and just self-hosted them and went that route. So not a lot of APIs. I think there was maybe one or two or maybe three that didn't make the jump from J2E to Jakarta, but most of these aren't widely used, so it wasn't a big deal. Managing dependencies. Yeah, overall, this could be a talk by itself. We're I'm personally a big fan of less is more when it comes to dependencies and really following those talking about how to manage, especially in the enterprise space when you're dealing with hundreds and thousands of integrations or tens of thousands of applications. Those cross-cutting dependencies can be really problematic. So yeah, definitely less is more, especially when you're supporting two release streams. So you've got your pre-Jakarta release stream going and your Jakarta release stream going. It can be tricky to have and manage. And a lot of this is about trying to be able to backport from, your Jakarta back into your pre-Jakarta. So less is more when it comes to it. A lot of the libraries, if you've been doing Java a while, a lot of these libraries there's a lot of new nifty JDK built-ins, alternatives to things. So definitely look at those. The NIO libraries for files, the concurrence, all the new collection, obviously the time libraries, things of that nature. Try to use those, as part of it and start dropping, some of these dependencies. It's kind of rough to pull in a whole, two or three libraries if you're using four methods out of it, right? Self-hosting sometimes can be better. Also, if you've got a bunch of simple util-based functions, that you're using like formatters and string formatters, time formatters, those are great candidates to be converted to lambdas and things like that. So leverage the language. The JDK is moving rapidly. It's great. And then the less dependencies you have, the easier it is going to be maintain your long-term Jakarta-based code base, but also moving between the Jakarta and the pre-Jakarta. We had two dependencies. We had to rehome Stomp JMS and Joram JMS tests. These were open source projects that the maintenance on it kind of stalled out and staled. went stale. So instead of trying to get those ramped back up, we took the approach of just self-homing these or rehoming them those back into the ActiveMQ main tree. Both of these were really just used as test dependencies anyway, so it wasn't a huge deal or anything that was blocker would impact. None of this would have impact like downstream application users. Most people would never know this happened. Um, the one of the things we had to make a decision on in the with the first release of 6.0 is we had to drop support. So ActiveMQ bundled a couple other downstream components, specifically Jalokia, which provides a HTTP based or REST based view into like JMX management beans for querying metrics and statistics. Um, Jalokia didn't have a Jakarta based release at the time when we released 6. So we temporarily dropped support for Jalokia. Same thing with Apache Camel. But both of those now have their Jakarta-based releases. So Jalokia has already been reintroduced, and I believe Apache Camel's going to be shortly. But just that was really more of like a time frame thing where we were ActiveMQ as a framework or as an infrastructure piece. When we started the change, it was kind of midstream in the Java ecosystem. So everything we really needed had already been converted, and a couple of these things that were tack-ons, it was okay for us to release and then bring them back when those were ready. Now, if you're doing your enterprise, I expect you'll be in good shape. Everything you need is should be Jakartified. All right, recommendations, best practices, and approaches. What works? The migration two-step, create that pre-Jakarta EE stable release version, pay down as much technical debt as possible. And then secondly, create a new JEE based major version release stream to run in parallel. The main thing here is you want this pre-Jakarta EE release because especially if you're in an enterprise in which you have is like frame in the frameworky or platform or on the edge of framework or platformy um, kind of scale, you're going to need to be able to provide, backports for security fixes and especially for dependency updates while you're doing your Jakarta E migration or while the consumers of your application or framework are making their Jakarta E migration. So a lot of this is about really more of like a product owner, program management over time, solving those challenges. And so this pre-Jakarta E release stream really helps with that. So this is where you want to drop any end of life and deprecated code modules from your code. You want to upgrade Maven, or if you're using Gradle and the plugins there, um, migrate or drop any end of life like third-party dependencies. Um, Anything that's redundant that you could use Java built-ins, take the time now to do that. Um, And then it's a good opportunity to upgrade to current non-Jakarta affected dependencies. These are dependencies that are going to get pulled in or dragged in transitively, things like log4j2, JUnit 5, things that you've been putting off or um, your managers and product owners haven't been excited about taking the time to take the time to go do these. So any of these, especially these big frameworky libraries that have also revved up, go ahead and grab those because there's going to be a good chance that as you upgrade your dependencies, they're going to drag these and kind of force you to it anyway. And of course, take this time to update your JDK. What we're doing in height for our products, we're going to make the jump straight to JDK 21. We're going to go ahead and skip 17. If you can go from 11 to 21, we think that's a pretty safe and healthy jump if you can do it. But that'd be a good kind of back pocket strategy to take with you. In the Jakarta EE release stream, this is your opportunity to update the Jakarta EE APIs. This is where you refactor your code to support the API changes. By and far, most of the APIs are a simple namespace changes. A few of them have a couple method signature or new methods that'll change, but I'd say for the most part, it's pretty standard. And so you might need to refactor your code to support the Jakarta API changes and possibly on the implementation of those APIs may have some code changes for you as well. Miscellaneous strategies. This is really, I think, just code project management type stuff. any low impact test only dependencies, if you can save that. One of the things we ran into is there was from a technical debt perspective, ActiveMQ's got about a couple thousand, several thousand unit tests, and there's I think three or four different mock libraries used. And if you've been uh, consistently coding in Java for the last couple of years, you know that mock libraries, test mock libraries, change pretty quickly, and the flavor of the day, probably a little more rapidly than other ones. Um, so those can be a challenge to deal with. Just maintaining those, maintaining the knowledge and the expertise across the different ones, what they do, what their best practices. Um, so I know this without trying to jump into a big fight. Um, just kind of keep in mind test only dependencies can be tricky over time because the cool hot one fades out pretty quick. If you're mocking is simple enough, making a test only implementation may be the move. If you've got complex in-house things that kind of look more like a framework or a platform, definitely do the two release strategy, get a modernized Java X version, and then work on your Jakarta-based EE. This is really what we're calling like the Jetty 12 approach. And then break your commits up. This is a more of like a Git management strategy. This was done in the ActiveMQ as well. We had a lot of we broke up the commits in different ways to help manage, keeping the health of the tree in good shape. If you can break up your commits to have the Jakarta namespace only changes, when you're making that big slice, they review much quicker because all you're really doing is going through and looking at the import lines, and there might be hundreds or thousands of those. Um, and so if you make a commit that's simply the import namespace change, and then the next commit come through, this is going to really speed up your review process and also the ability for you to backport changes. And if you've got any client side, data only or smallish modules that you can create to kind of separate, again, a lot of this is about dragging transitive dependencies. This is similar to what we did in ActiveMQ with that Jakarta module. If you can create some client side data only modules, you can kind of decouple yourself from some of the API uh, as well. All right, let's take a minute to just look at where ActiveMQ is today. Um, just kind of give everybody an update. First, let's look at the migration stats. We'll talk about the release table, and we'll talk a little bit about roadmap, and then we'll be able to roll right into questions. Okay, this ended up being the migration stats. So there was one super big pull request off the main branch. It consisted of 25 different commits. Over time, that really was about 100 commits during I think this PR probably sat for months while the issues were worked through. So it's probably over 100 total commits, but ended up kind of getting merged and shuffled to 25 before the final merge. A total of 1,425 files were changed, a little over 9,500 lines were added, another 8,000 lines were removed. We dropped two Maven modules from the tree. Two dependencies were rehomed. We dropped two frameworks. We had that one JE API that we deprecated that we dropped. And there were a total like 28 kind of big chunky work tasks that sat on the PR and served as discussion points across the team. And there were about 80 build jobs that ran till we got there. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it looked like, for ActiveMQ. So if you've got decently a reasonable approximation in your enterprise, I says in your bosses and your management team or product owners asking you, hey, give us some stats, you could use this as a starting point to provide some estimation of what this would look like. So this is the release chart today. ActiveMQ. So the 6.0 was the first Jakarta, based broker release, and we've since released a 6.1. So 6.0 was released about a year ago, November of 23. Currently, the two live release streams are the 6.1 and the 5.18. And you can see here how we're aligning the release versions, JDK, key specs, and what we're calling major dependencies. So 6.1 is JDK 17 plus, JMS 3.1, Spring 6, Jet 11. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, we are working on making that jump of ActiveMQ to Jetty 12, which will also take us to the latest version of the Jakarta EE. So, ActiveMQ where ActiveMQ jumped in was kind of midstream, the whole ecosystem, making the change to Jakarta. And so we've got one more step to get current. And then 518 is leveled on JDK 11, JMS 2, Spring 5.3, Jetty 9. So, and you can see here 518 is where we did that magic where we supported both JavaX and JMS on the client side. Roadmap, exciting capabilities and features ahead for ActiveMQ. We're adding tons of new metrics for connection, for really just observability, I'd call it, overall, being able to keep an eye on queue message flows, things like that, especially things that support running inside Kubernetes or cloud environments. We got organizations really looking to support new multi-tenancy queues of service capabilities. And so these metrics really drive to support that. So there's new metrics for connection health observability. Connection health is important in Kubernetes for when you're running behind load balancers and you're dealing with connections from inside and outside of clusters in the cloud, outside of the cloud, things of that nature. Network connectivity over long distances can be tricky. Also, new metrics for message flow observability, metrics for persistent store performance in the cloud. One of the things we observe is a high degree of variance in like persistent store performance. And so if we have more visibility to what those metrics, we can identify brokers running on slow nodes. And just in general, adding more features to enhance, currently ActiveMQ has great multi-tenancy support, but there's always more and more advanced policies that could be added. And so there's new hooks and things being done there to support more capabilities around multi-tenancy. Also really excited to be working on this one. So I've got the PR out there. It's pretty close to getting merged for virtual thread technical preview. I know there's already been a couple talks on virtual threads, and ActiveMQ is a great candidate for that, being able to take advantage of virtual threads and the performance benefits that'll come with that, and then provide even further scalability and performance for ActiveMQ. 7, the plans are starting to come together. 7, all this is really subject to change, but with Spring really making that announcement that they'll be dropping support for open source releases in the 5 series. We're looking on the ActiveMQ side is dropping Spring as kind of the main bootstrapping wiring component. So we're going to have an option to run Spring free on the server side. So we're excited about that. So it'll just be a simple, bootstrap component that'll replace what Spring does. But along with that will come with a new configuration service. And the idea on that is we'd have more ability to do runtime configuration without having to restart brokers, more things about tuning multi-tenancy, so you could provision multi-tenancy, multi-tenant message flows and things like that without having to do broker restarts, which is great for when you're doing platforms in the cloud, queue as a service, dedicated clusters, things like that. And then continue to modernize. So really, I think ActiveMQ 7 is about getting back to the basics, performance, not forcing the Spring pieces in there and being more, leveraging more of the JDK built-ins. Like a lot of what we're suggesting here is go more, JDK native. And that's what ActiveMQ is doing in 7. So the current release stream is V6.1 and 6.2 will be the next new feature release stream. So a lot of these new features have already been merged in. We could take a look at, we got that here, kind of a deep dive on the features. It's like the advanced message statistics. So at NQ time, you now can see the last NQ'd message ID, what client ID that was, what was the message timestamp and the broker in time. So you can measure the latency between the application sending and the broker receiving it. Same thing on the DQ time, you'll get the message ID, the client ID, the message timestamp, what was the broker in and the broker out time. So this is in pull request. This will go into 6.2 and 5.18. Similarly, there's an advanced network statistics metric. This is already merged in 6.2 and it's already been released in 5.18, but this provides network NQ and network DQ counts so you can get a track when messages come into a queue. was it NQ'd or DQ'd via an application connection or a network connection in a cluster, essentially. Virtual thread supports in technical preview. The pull request is already there. It's targeting for 6.2. So 6.2 is really shaping up to be a cool feature release. And you'll see a bunch of these features are also going back to that simultaneous 5.18. The message interceptor strategy. This is a per namespace capability to provide more multi-tenant policies. This is really cool because multi or destination policy is where this is added. This can be used for providing that more advanced multi-tenant policies, things like on a per message flow basis. What expirations do you want to allow? Do you want to require compression? Do you want to limit supported message types? Do you want to specify some required headers, things like that? So this is a pretty cool piece on a server side basis. You can really enforce policy. So if an application were to send something that's outside a policy, it would get rejected at send time. So these kinds of things you could find and hone your application teams in when they're doing their event-driven applications and messaging applications to really adhere to your strategy at development time and instead of waiting to get to production or when you run into a support issue. So the message interceptor strategy piece that's already been released in 5.18 and it's merged into 6.2. So these are some of the exciting things coming in the Jakarta and the pre-Jakarta ActiveMQ releases. And for reference, on the open source side, we've got a couple links that are tracking the big feature work. So there's a JMS2 page, which tracks the Jakarta and JMS 3.1.2.0 progress. There's only a couple JMS API spec features that aren't out there or that are not completed yet. I think we're down to 2 or 3. So those will be wrapped up in the next couple point releases on the 6.0 side and then also backported into the 5.18 point releases. And then the virtual thread work, right now it's in technical preview. There's a special placeholder page there for that that'll track the progress of that release. Once that goes out, it'll be really interesting to start seeing performance tests, comparisons out of the box. Some of the main locks in ActiveMQ are already re-entrant, so it's cool. But there's also a bunch of synchronized spots, so we'll be looking for hotspots and making thoughtful changes on how to optimize ActiveMQ to really take advantage of virtual threads to be able to take the benefit of that high connection count, high destination count, low message traffic. I think is where we'll see the big boost when you've got thousands and thousands of connections or thousands and thousands of queues, but you're doing a really low volume of messages. I think that's where we'll see the virtual threads come in. On this topic, I've blogged about the ActiveMQ transition to Jakarta. I've got part 1 and part 2. Part 1 is really an intro about Jakarta. Part 2 starts diving into the guts and the details like we did in this talk. So check those out. Those are on the Hype blog. And we'll be posting a part 3, which contains most of the content or the remaining content that we already shared here on this talk. So you'll be able to catch that. And there's a little bit more deep dive and details in there as well. So excellent. All right, we're doing okay on time. Let me check and see if we have any questions out there. All right. Okay, what is the deal with ActiveMQ Artemis? Is that a different product? Yes, ActiveMQ. So Artemis is a second broker that's under the ActiveMQ umbrella. It was donated to the Apache community. And there was some thought at one point that it might become ActiveMQ 6. That hasn't been the case. So ActiveMQ 6 is based on really the mainline broker that's pervasively developed. There's just too many changes. I feel like there's been too many changes. It's been difficult to make that migration from ActiveMQ to Artemis for a lot of folks. So it's gonna be a long runtime on ActiveMQ. I'll do another blog post, kind of share my thoughts on Artemis in general. So be a lookout for that. But what we're seeing is there's a long roadmap and path forward with ActiveMQ 6 and going into 7. So we're excited about that and where that's going. All right. Well, thank you for the great question and appreciate you guys joining for my talk. And yeah, look for me. I'm on GitHub, Madar Pav. Or if you've got any questions, hit us there. And thank you for taking the time to join JakartaOne Livestream.